Hopefully everybody got their books and something to write with. Take notes. Remember, that's what this class is. This is called Limmuwdyah class, which means teachers of Yahweh, being taught by Yahweh. Okay? And the whole object of this book is the whole object of this class is not just to read a book, but to actually break it down and look into it and see what it says. So we're going to start off here on page 151, where we had left off. This is chapter 12. This is page 151 of the new books. I'm not sure the old one. But anyway, it's chapter 12. The resurrection of the dead and the Messiah. Okay, it says, alas, alas. It says the word resurrection simply means a restoring of life to one who is dead. Eob, or Yashub, is clearly speaking of a resurrection of the dead in Eob 14, verses 14 through 15. And the King James, it says, if a man die, shall he live again? Notice it's a question. All the days of my appointed time will I wait till my change come. Thou shalt call, and I will answer thee. Thou wilt have a desire for the work of thy hands. Okay? So here, rather than actually Yashub 14, and 15 asking a question, as the King James has it, and they do that a lot too. You know, they put question marks behind these things. Anytime he deals with the faith, basically that's when they put question marks. They make it into a form of a question to try and make a person doubt and not really see what it says. But rather than asking a question here, Yeshua 14 actually makes a statement of fact, because Hebrew is written without question marks. And it's the translators who added them as they thought it was necessary. And we see here in the Interlinear Bible English, Interlinear Bible Hebrew English by Baker Bookhouse, Volume 2, page 1343. That's the Interlinear Bible Hebrew English by Baker Bookhouse, Volume 2, page 1343. It says in verses 14 and 15, now if you notice here, you should have your books, but if you notice in here, it has Hebrew is read from left to right, so you go this way with it, and that's exactly how you will read it in here, okay? And so reading it as Hebrew writes it, it says, "If dies a man, he shall revive. All the days of my warfare will I await, until comes my change. You shall call, and I shall answer you." Okay? So you see here, it's actually making a statement. It's not really asking a question, because if you notice, like it says in King James, if a man die, will he live again? Well, that's doubting the resurrection, right? That's putting doubt in people's minds, and that's what the King James Version does. But if you have the wisdom of Yahweh, as Pastor said, you can understand the King James Version if you keep it according to Yahweh's plan. It is written in such a way into which they've taken things, and in some cases they will take certain words and put them in front of another word, and it totally changes the way it sounds. But when you look it up in the original, you can see that it's totally different. So if a man dies, he will be revived, okay? He will live again. That's what Yahweh is saying, because that is the promise that Yahweh gives. And of course, even the Apostle Shaul was faced with this, where, he said, if there's no resurrection, then really the hope for man is kind of bland. If this is the only life you got to live, and you can't expect no more than this, then that's not too much living, But he was encountered that very same thing, and he talks about how that Yeshua was resurrected, And of course, when you believe the scriptures and believe what Yahweh says, you can see those things without any problem. Now, if you notice here, he says, in verse 15, he says, the days of my warfare, okay? The days of my warfare. And think about that word warfare. In 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 6, it says, for though we walk, that is, we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in Yahweh, for pulling down strongholds. And then he tells you what those strongholds are. Demolishing arguments and destroying every high thing that exalts itself against the one who is Yahweh. Why? Because otherwise you make yourself into a god, right? A god is one who lifts himself up above Yahweh. So demolishing all arguments and destroying every high thing that exalts itself against the one who is Yahweh, bringing under control, notice, every thought into the obedience as the Messiah. Okay, just as Yeshua did. He set the example for us. And being in readiness to punish all disobedience once your obedience is complete. Well, of course, you don't punish yourself, but you correct yourself. You bring yourself under subjection to the laws of Yahweh. And that's what Yahweh wants us to see and realize. So this scripture, as it said on the bottom of the page, actually says, Yeshua 14:14, if a man dies, he will live again. Okay, that's the promise of Yahweh. Now look over to page 152 here. He says, death has always been the hardest thing in man's life to face. It's just like the age-old question, like, well, why were we created? Where did we come from? These are things that are found in the scriptures if people would just believe what the scriptures write. A Christian may say, well, when you die, where do you go? Well, go to heaven. Well, where's heaven, and what do you do in heaven? Find me a scripture that talks about you go to heaven, and find me a scripture that says you're going to do something once you get there. And they're completely dumbfounded because they have no idea what the afterlife means. They have no idea what it actually means. And so it just shows that it's a blind faith that they have, and they have no hope. But death has always been the hardest thing in a man's life to face. This is truly mainly because most people do not understand about the hereafter. In other words, hardly anyone understands the plan of Yahweh. Simply by understanding a few things about the plan of Yahweh, the thought of the death of one's physical body, and even of someone else, losing a loved one and so forth, would be much easier to face, okay? Because you understand, and that's the thing, that's the hope that lies within us. We understand that we'll be resurrected, so we have a better outlook on those things, can handle them much easier because Yahweh has given us that comfort and that understanding. Well, Yahweh limited mankind to a relatively short span of life. It's not very long. That's not very long at all to live, even to 100 years old. That's nothing, But he did this for a reason. He limited mankind to a relative short span of life for a reason. Mankind could have been made like the Malachim. But, many of the Malachim rebelled against Yahweh, as the scripture plainly shows. So he could have been made like mankind, but many of the Malachim, they rebelled against Yahweh, and scripture shows that. And the very fact that Genesis 1:1 shows you exactly what took place there with them. Well, since it's possible for the Malachim to turn against Yahweh's righteous way of life, then Yahweh's plan is to make man into a much higher state of being. He's made a little lower right now, but he's going to be a much greater state of being. A state like Yahweh himself, actually. Yahweh will actually be capable of ruling, mankind will actually be capable of ruling over the works that Yahweh has created. This psalm just blows me away every time I read it. It's just so astounding. Psalm 8. And we're going to read verses 3 through 6. He says, when we just think about and consider the heavens. Now, we're talking about beyond what you can see out there at nighttime. And even the things that you see with telescopes and the pictures that these satellites and things have taken, When we consider your work, your heavens, the work your fingers frame, because Yahweh did all of this, the work of the moon, and that in itself is pretty astounding, and the stars which by you were ordained. Because you see, you couldn't remain alive without the moon. You'd die without the moon. The moon is out there, but it's something that we need. It's necessary for human life to be able to survive. The earth needs the moon, and Yahweh placed it there. And of the stars, those are the visible ones that we can see and so forth. But notice, which were by you ordained. So these things were ordained by Yahweh. That word ordained it means it's number 3559, and it means to be set up, established, to be fixed, to be stable. Now notice, it's established. It's something that Yahweh has established. It's fixed. It's something that doesn't waver back and forth. Yahweh has made these things, and he made them to be stable. He made them to be secure, although right now he's allowing, the spirit beings to do what they want to do, and there's much destruction going on throughout the heavens. But also it's enduring and to be ready, and notice, to be prepared, because he is preparing these things for us. There's no telling how many different parts throughout the universe that Yahweh is making and preparing right now for us to one day have. And it means to be settled. It's ordered. To be restored, because we are going to have to go back and restore much of the universe that has been destroyed at certain times. So these are the things that he says. These are ordained. All of these places that Yahweh has made has been ordained for us. In fact, you can see here how Earth is affected by the constellations and the planets in the universe. In Yeshua 38, verses 31 to 33, Yahweh says, can you bind the chains of Pleiades or loose the band of Orion? You see Orion. Orion usually late at night is over in the sky out there. And Pleiades, that's the 7 stars together. Now, people with great eyesight can see 6, sometimes maybe all 7. But that's how sometimes in the ancients they would pick their watchers. And if a person could look up there, most people don't see that many. You might see 3 to 5. Maybe you make out 3 to 5 of the stars. That's it. But somebody who's got really great sharp eyesight can pick out 6 or all 7 of them. Those are the kind of people that use as their watchers to sit up in the towers and to watch, because they can look and see it for a very long distance if anybody was coming up on the city and so forth. But he says, can you bind the chains? In other words, these things that hold these things together. Notice it talks like a chain. It's not a literal chain that's out there, right? Not just like there's no chains that hold Satan and the band of Orion. But it's the things that hold these things together. It's all the laws that Yahweh's put together that hold these constellations together in their places. Can you bring forth the Mazareth, the constellations, in their seasons? They're scattered out all over the place. And as the earth turns, we begin to see these things. And, we see different ones than what you do in the southern hemisphere. They have different constellations that they see down there. He says, can you guide Ortegas with her sons, or with his sons, the bear and the cubs? That's the Big Dipper and Little Dipper, okay? Do you know the ordinance of the heavens? Notice. Can you establish their rule upon the earth? So these things they run by ordinances. They run by the laws that Yahweh has put into place, and they actually hold influence and give influence upon the earth. So these things actually affect us. In fact, one more here. You remember Yirmiah 31, verses 35 to 37. He says, this is what Yahweh says, who gives the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and the stars for a light by night. Now, if you remember, Genesis chapter 1, when it goes through all the creation and so forth, it tells you about the creation of the moon. And Yahweh set the 2 lights in the heavens, one of the sun and one of the moon. And he made ordinances for these things to take place, and for them to do what they're supposed to do, how they actually feed us and make mankind, sustain our lives by their influences in the heavens. So he says these are the ordinances of the moon and the stars. And he also says, remember, he says he put the sun and the moon and the stars, okay, for mankind. And the stars for a light by night, who stirs up the sea so its waves roar. Yahweh of hosts is his name. You never really see a calm ocean, right? The waves are always moving constantly and so forth. And Yahweh is the one who's put these laws into effect so that this actually takes place. But he also said, too, if you remember, He said boundaries. When he created the earth, he set boundaries for the waters so that the waters will not overflow. They'll only come up, even if they raise high tide, they'll come up to a certain stage, and then they'll settle back down. Well, all this is done by the moon, with the influence that the moon has, the gravitational pulls and so forth upon the earth. Verse 36, he says, if those ordinances would depart from me, notice, if those ordinances depart from before me, says Yahweh, then the seed of Israel also will cease from being a nation before me forever. So these ordinances, these things that he has set in the heavens, have a direct influence upon us here on earth to sustain us. And if they would disappear, so would all life on earth. Okay? Because Yahweh made all this in the very beginning, as it talked about in Genesis. Verse 37, so this is what Yahweh says. If heaven above can be measured, and it can't be, right? The universe is unfathomable, it's immeasurable. You can't measure it. With the universe, we used to talk about light years and stuff. Well, light years just like boggles the mind, how far light can travel within a year when it travels so many thousands of miles per second, But yet, when astronomy talks about these things, this area is so huge and vast that they actually use symbols to designate this gigantic, large areas that, we just can't fathom how big something like that is, But they do. Verse 37, so this is what Yahweh says. If heaven above could be measured, and the foundations of the earth beneath searched out or explored, then I will also cast off all, notice, if that could be done, then I will also cast off all the seed of Israel because of all that they have done, says Yahweh. So you see, this shows Yahweh's love and mercy, because there's no way that you can measure the heavens. There's no way. And if these things would be done away with, then he says, then my covenant would be done away with. Okay? So basically what he's just using is that as a comparison to show you that, he does watch over us and take care of us. Okay, in Psalm 8, verse 4 here, so he says, so now thinking of all that, notice what he says in verse 4. What is man? What is man that you're even mindful of man? What is he? What makes mankind so special to Yahweh? And remember, he does call us as a special treasure, right? So he says, and the Son of Man, now notice, Son of Man, only mankind has these promises, these blessings. It's not the sons of the gods, but only mankind, okay? What is man that you're mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you visit him? Visit. We used to think like, oh, hello, can I come inside? I want to talk to you. That's a visit, right? The word visit, much, much deeper than that. The word visit is number 6485. It means to pay attention, to observe. As mentioned before, Yahweh watches our actions. He looks down upon us, and he sees what's going on. The word visit also means to appoint or to assign, because that's what Yahweh is looking for. Names are reserved in the heavens, and he's going to appoint and assign certain jobs for us in his kingdom. It means to lay upon as a charge. Okay? Remember how Abraham, he kept all of Yahweh's laws? All that was charged to Abraham, he kept. He was obedient to those things. It means a deposit. Remember, as the Spirit Holy is given as a down payment to us as to what is to come, it says. Visit also means to be passed in review. Of course, Yahweh's testing us to see what our resolve is, right? He's testing us. He wants to see, what are we going to do? How are we going to handle situations? Visit means to be caused to miss, to be called, or to be called into account. Because blessings and curses have been placed before us, and we have the ability to choose these things, what we want to do. So we can be caused to miss. Remember the definition of sin? The definition of sin means to miss the mark. Okay? To miss the mark. And of course the mark is, our whole objective is the mark of Yahweh to be upon us. But the definition of sin is to miss the mark. So as it says, his visit will cause to miss or to be called upon and called to account. So we are going to be held in account for what we do. And then visit also means to set over, to make overseer, or to appoint an overseer, because that's the promises that's given to those who overcome sin. That is, to be like Yahweh himself. And we're going to be appointed as overseers. Okay? So today in this earthly life, we have a great example because we have our overseer, our earthly overseer, who sets that example to show us how things are done. If you remember how he talked about in his sermons, how he said Yahweh's given it to him a very small kingdom to run. But it's astounding how that man can comprehend and realize all that's going on in the house of Yahweh and keep track of all of these things. You know? Visit also means to entrust or commit for care, okay? Because the earth and the blessings of life is going to be handed over to the saints. So when he says here in verse 4, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? He's talking about he's going to give these offices to those who overcome, okay? And that's why it says here, you've made man a little lower than the Malachim. I like that. We're made just a little bit lower than the Malachim. You know how powerful a Malach is? But we're made a little bit lower. If you remember, it also says in Psalm 115, verse 16, that the heaven of heavens belong to Yahweh, but the earth he has given to the children of man, right? He's given to the children of men the earth. This is our home planet. This is what he's made us for, given this to us. And we'll always have it. Mankind will always be on earth, and earth will always exist, and we'll always have mankind here on earth. For you will have made him a little lower than the Malachim. But notice, even though we're a little bit lower, okay, in Yahweh's eyes, that's just a little bit lower, you know, in his eyes. He's the creator. But you will crown him with glory and honor. Notice, glory and honor. That's the promise that Yahweh has given unto us, you know. Now, usually when you think about all that's involved in the word visit, you know, it's much more than just going over to see someone, right, and spend a little bit of time with them. So you can see that how much the Christians do not understand these things, and this is only given to the house of Yahweh. But you will make him a little bit low. But notice, you're going to crown him with glory and honor, but first the suffering has to come, okay? The suffering has to come. In Revelations 3:11, you notice it says, behold, I come quickly. Hold that which you have, and let no man take your crown, okay? Because remember, he says here, he's going to crown him. He's going to crown mankind with glory and honor. But first, the suffering has to come, okay? In Romans 8:18 says, for I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which will be revealed in us. So, when you got a headache, when you got a backache, when you got a stomach ache, whatever kind of ache you got, you know, everybody's suffering from all sorts of different ailments in the house of Yahweh. We have to remember that this is all going to pass one day. And what Yahweh has in store for us is going to be far greater. Because remember, we're not going to experience any more pain when the time comes. And that is such a great blessing, you know. And that's the reason why Pastor said, you know, well, if you're not suffering pain, maybe I'll pray for you so that you do. So you can comprehend and understand what it means when someone suffers with pain. Because we have to have that empathy for one another, right? We have to understand those things. Now notice, he says, you made man to be the ruler over the works of your hands. So notice why man was made. He was made to be a ruler over the works of Yahweh. And you will put all things under his feet, notice. Notice why man is made. Man is made to be a ruler, okay? That word rule. Ruler means to have exercise or dominion. In fact, that's the way the King James says it. Uses the word dominion. Dominion means the power to rule a country or a region It also means supreme authority and absolute ownership. What do you learn in the Peaceful Solution? That everyone owns things, right? Supreme authority is going to be given to the sons of Yahweh, of course. Now, absolute ownership. Think about Psalm 115, verse 16, because Yahweh says, the heaven of heavens belong to Yahweh, but the earth he has given to the children of men. So the children of men own the earth. Okay? It's given into us. Psalm 37. Right there. Psalm 37. It says, do not let your anger flare up because of evildoers, neither be zealous against the workers of iniquity. There's really no need for that, right? Why do we need to be upset because someone commits iniquity? You know, there's no sense for it. But they will soon be cut down like grass and wither like the green plant. They will fade away. Trusting you, great Yahweh, and doing righteousness, we shall dwell in your land and be fed on your faithfulness. Delight in great Yahweh and trust only in him, and he will bring to pass the desires of our hearts. Verse 8, cease from anger and do no evil. Forsake wrath, for it only leads to evil, right? Two wrongs don't make a right. Retaliation doesn't resolve anything. Verse 9, for evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait on Yahweh, they're going to inherit the earth. Remember, Yahweh gave the children of men the earth. For yet a little while, then the wicked will be no more, and you shall seek, but you will not find him. Because when Yahweh's kingdom is established, there will be no wickedness. There will be no sinners. Verse 11, the meek shall inherit the earth. You know, the Christians talk about that, but they have no idea what that even means. They shall delight themselves in great peace. Verse 34, wait on Yahweh, keep Yahweh's way, and you will be exalted. Remember what we just read about being glorified and honored? You will be exalted to inherit the earth. You shall witness the wicked ones be cut off. Okay? Because Yahweh's going to do away with all forms of wickedness. And he's going to allow mankind to take the positions that they've been trained for. And that's why we have such a great and awesome opportunity right now. So, when this is understood and believed, it does make death easier to handle, because you realize the plan of Yahweh for mankind. And we know that in this life, you're not going to live forever, you know. Dying, you shall die. And we already got strikes against us, because you remember, when we were born into this earth, the scripture says we were born in sin. And our mothers conceived us in iniquity. So, you know, we were already born as a sinful being. And we're born with a carnal mind that hates our Creator. And as we grow up, we know nothing but hatred and rebellion, because we're born into this world. You know, so that's where Yahweh's blessings come in, because of the fact that He will call us out of this world and give us a change. So when we understand these things, we can understand this a little bit easier. And it does make it much easier. So let's continue on here, knowing those things. So the actual plan of Yahweh from the beginning was to create in mankind a being that's capable of having dominion over the works of Yahweh's hands, as Psalms 8 verse 6 says. Remember, supreme authority, absolute ownership. Okay, this is what Yahweh wants to give. And of course, it's the same concept as with a child and a parent. A child may own something, but who's the ultimate owner? You know, it's the parent, because the parent is the one who allows the child to have that. Because the parent can also say, no, you're not going to have that. I don't want you to own that particular thing. You give it back to whoever it is, or you don't think about obtaining one or buying one or anything like that, you know. And it's the same with Yahweh. Yahweh is going to give us this authority because we're going to be made into the image and likeness of Yahweh. and we're going to have dominion over all the works of Yahweh's hands. So it's apparent that the Malachims were first set in charge of Yahweh's works, but many of them rebelled in bitter hatred against their own Creator. And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. So mankind, in his present state, of course, has also rebelled against his own Creator. And mankind has taken on the character of Satan, rather than causing all manner of suffering to go upon, or thereby causing all manner of suffering to come upon his fellow man, because that's the route he's chosen. So he's not showing love for his neighbor by doing that, by going Satan's way. But Yahweh emphatically will not allow suffering in the new world when it comes. There's not going to be any suffering. You remember what it says in Revelations 21, verse 4, and Yahweh will wipe away the tears from their eyes, and there will be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, nor will there be any more pain, for the former things have passed away. So if the former things have passed away, that means there's not going to be any more, okay? So Yahweh is going to completely remove death. He's going to take this off of us. So he's not going to allow suffering in the new world. Because you can just imagine, if you had a spiritual body, and you had all the authority that comes along with having that spiritual body, your pleasure is going to be so increased by millions of times of magnitude. Can you imagine the extremity that you would suffer if you had a body like that? Now the Christians will tell you, you're going to burn in hellfire forever. There's no such thing. Scriptures don't teach that. If a person dies, they die. When the second death comes, they're going to be destroyed. They're not going to live forever in torment, and that would be so cruel of a thing to do. It just shows that their foolishness and their ignorance of who their Creator actually is. So Yahweh wants a family of beings that will live together in peace and in harmony. He wants a family that he can trust to not lust after anything his brother might have. Now remember, he gives us 10 commandments. And the last one of those 10 commandments is, you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor, right? So he wants to trust us that we will not break that law, that we will not lust after these things. Because if we did, again, with the power that you would have, with having your subconscious mind and being the authority figure that you would be, as being a spiritual being in that manner, if you did this, you would be worse than the Malachim. You would do things worse than Satan herself. Because, remember, man's going to be greater than the Malachim themselves. So you would be such a horrible, wretched being that you literally would destroy the universe, Much greater than what Satan's doing at this time. So Yahweh's not going to allow any of that. He wants a family that will be persistent in true righteousness, who will not have hatred, envy, jealousy, nor rebellion against the perfect laws of peace that Yahweh has enacted through the Holy Scriptures. And of course, that's the reason for our test. We have to be tested to see, will we do this? Do we still harbor hatred? Do we have envy? Do we sometimes get jealous about certain things? And do we rebel against authority? So all of these things are tests that Yahweh's dealing with to try and show us that we can be made perfect in His sight if we allow Him to work within us, right? We've got to allow Him to work within us. Okay, so he goes on, he says, Yahweh wants a family that will have the very character He has, the very character of Yahweh. Yahweh's character will be one of true love and also the deep concern for those who are righteous. It's Yahweh's character that brings trust to those around you who will also be righteous. It is His character that Yahweh has planned from the beginning to put in each member of His family. Remember, Genesis 1:26, He says, Then Yahweh said, I will make man in my image. I will make man in my image. He didn't make mankind to be like the gods. He made mankind to be in his image, like Yahweh himself. Okay? Now, if you remember, the word make, maybe you don't remember, but anyway, maybe you looked it up before. But Genesis 1:26, that word make, it means to do or to fashion. Okay? And that's what Yahweh has done. He's fashioned us in a certain way. He's made mankind. Remember in Genesis, Yahweh goes through in the first chapter of Genesis, and he tells you all the things that he made. And he says, he made this, and he made it right. And he made this, and he made it right. And he says, he made this after its kind, and he made that after its kind. So everything was made after its own kind, and Yahweh saw that everything that he made was right. Okay? It was righteous, just exactly the perfect way that he had made it in the very beginning. As mankind has corrupted the whole earth and has destroyed everything that has been made. But when Yahweh made it, he made everything right. Okay? So this word make, it means to fashion, it means to accomplish, because Yahweh is going to do his plan. It means to make or to act with effect. You know, Yahweh, whenever Yahweh says, like he says, his word that goes forth is not going to return back into him void. It's going to accomplish the thing in which he set it out to do, as the prophet Isaiah said. It means to appoint, to ordain. These are things that Yahweh wants to give. Remember in Hebrews it says he's reserved a place for us in the heavens, right? Our office is reserved already for us. He wants to appoint or to ordain or to institute, which he has instituted the house of Yahweh. Notice what else it means. We can't get away from this, right? It means to press or to squeeze. Why? Because you got to be tested, right? You got to be tested. You got to go through trials and tribulations, because Yahweh has to prove. You know, it has to be proven, and he's got to prove us to see, will we, you know, is this really what we want? And we can only prove ourselves through the trials and the tests. We got to go through them. There's no other way. So he goes on, he says, for Yahweh said, I will make man in my image according to my likeness, and they will have rulership. There's that word, rulership, that dominion, that absolute authority and ownership over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. You're going to have absolute ownership because of the fact that you'll be able to control the microbes. Everything is made out of microorganisms. So therefore, with the power over the microorganisms, you will actually own them and be able to control them only in the way of righteousness, though. Of course, that's the thing. You see, we will never, ever, ever abuse. What does the peaceful solution teach? Is respect. You know, it teaches you to have respect for yourself, for others, and for all the environment, right? So you will never, ever disrespect the microbial world. You'll always hold them into the highest esteem, because you know that they're your servants. And you will be able to have the authority over them. And they will trust you that you will do the things that Yahweh commands of you. And they'll know, and that's the reason why you'll have power, because they will know and trust you that you will never, ever cause them any harm, as mankind is causing harm now to them. They will realize and trust you that you will never cause them harm. You will never do anything that would cause them to do something that would harm another being. And so when Yahweh says in Revelations there that there will be no more suffering, no more pain, that's what he's talking about. Because these creatures will no longer have to be forced into mutations and live the lives in which they're bound to at this time. That's why it says in Romans 8 that all creation is waiting to be revealed by the sons of Yahweh. You know, they're waiting for the sons of Yahweh to be revealed so that they can be redeemed, it says. You know, because they're suffering at this time, and they want their redemption. Okay. So Yeshua taught that man should live by every word of Yahweh, Matthew 4:4. And Yeshua proved himself faithful to Yahweh's every word before he suffered death upon the tree. And Yeshua was given power. He was given dominion over all the creatures of the earth. And Pastor says, to understand the powers that Yeshua had, read of his power over wildlife in Matthew 17, 24 through 27. That's when he talked about the fish. You know, it said, told his disciples, go and get this certain fish. You know, stick your line out there, and the first fish that comes is going to bite and pull them up, and there's coins in the mouth. And go and pay those taxes. He had power over material things in Matthew 14, verses 14 to 21. That's when he fed the over 5,000. You know, we always think 5,000, but remember when it says 5,000 men. Okay? Above, also with the children, women and children. And he did that with 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's it. 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, who knows? Them loaves of bread probably little tiny things too, you know. And he had enough to multiply to feed over 5,000 people. Boy, wouldn't Meals on Wheels like to have that, huh? So, he also, as it says here, had power in heaven and earth in Matthew 28:18. Notice what Matthew 28:18, you know. He says, and Yeshua came and spoke to him, saying, all authority is given to me in heaven and in earth. So at that point, Yeshua had been given full authority over the microbes, both in heaven and in the earth. He was the first one to achieve that, remember. We're all going to have that as well, if we overcome. That's the promise that Yahweh has given to us. So you can see this is something we should really be shooting for and really desire to have, right? It's really amazing what Yahweh has in store. And like it says, too, remember, it's never into the heart of man for understanding. It's never into our minds for us to be able to comprehend, you know, all the things that Yahweh has in store for us. It's just unfathomable. We just can't comprehend the things that Yahweh has in store for us. But when we read these things and see these things in the Scriptures, it gives us a little taste to be able to understand what this is about. And Yeshua himself didn't experience it all. Even though he had this authority and he could walk on water, he still didn't have all that Yahweh was going to give to him. He's waiting for us. So when he returns and then we're all called together and Yahweh will give out the rewards, then Yeshua will actually receive his full reward and his full power and authority. But man, what he has now is just phenomenal. So the same power that Yeshua had is the power of Yahweh that was planned for all those who will overcome the temptations of Satan and will then live by every word of Yahweh as Yeshua lived. When we live by Yahweh's every word, we learn to love Yahweh with all of our hearts. Matthew 22, 36 through 40. And love also our neighbors as ourselves. Back in Mark 12, 29 through 33. The every word of Yahweh was written in the book, in the law, of the law, in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, and Leviticus 19:18. Now, this is what Yeshua taught. Remember, he said, all the law hangs, all the 613 laws hang on these 2 commandments. Love Yahweh with all your heart, soul, and might, and love your neighbor as yourself. Because all of the 613 laws of Yahweh fit in one of those 2 categories. And if you love Yahweh with all your heart, soul, and your might, you're going to worship him. You're going to do those things that are pleasing. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you're not going to steal from your neighbor. You're not going to defraud your neighbor. You're not going to do anything that causes harm to your neighbor or to yourself, because if you love your neighbor as yourself, you're going to keep the peaceful solution. You're not going to do any harm to your neighbor or to yourself. Nor will you do any harm to any environment, to any of the microbial world. You won't sin against your neighbor or sin against yourself to cause the microbial world to be tortured and mutated and in so much discomfort to where they're crying out. And that's what occurred whenever Yahweh said to Cain, you know, your brother's blood is crying out from the earth, because they were defiling the earth. You know, for one thing, when you go hunt an animal, when you drain all the blood out of an animal, you're supposed to bury it, cover it with earth, and let the microbes take it over and do it. You're not supposed to just leave it out on the ground, a pool of blood. You know, how much more so, that's an animal, how much more so a human being when they die. I remember the Crusaders, they went out and they slaughtered everybody, and the bodies just left out there and rotted, and the blood flowed all over the place. And all this did was just corrupt the earth. And then when the gods had the dinosaurs and all this, the cavemen and all this kind of crud that they made and used in war machinery, and all of these things died, they just defiled the earth by laying it on the ground. You know, so blood defiles, all of these things. So Yahweh tells us, he gives us his laws, how we can straighten all this mess up. And remember, it's going to take us 7 moons, 7 full months, just to clean up the earth, to get it to a state to where we can start working with something here. Could be that much carnage on the earth. And then it's going to be ashes under our feet. So what survives, dies, and is laid out there and hasn't burned up, that's what we're going to have to go find, the bits and pieces of people. Okay, the next section here is called the calling. Well, now, every human being in this world is born with a cardinal mind. And that cardinal mind every human being has is simply blinded to the fact that sin is what's causing all the miserable conditions in the world. Sin, as 1 Yahweh 3:4 says, is the breaking of Yahweh's laws. But the carnal mind can't comprehend that. Come on, man, you know, if it feels good, then do it. Remember, that was the old expression way, way back in the 70s. And that's what destroyed all of society. You know, and you went from the wild, crazy 60s into the 70s, to the 80s, into the 90s. Now you're in the 2000s, and you can see that today it's gotten so much greater in sin than what it was ever before, to where their minds of understanding is just completely gone. And this is what the scripture talks about when it talks about the confusion, right? Babylon, mystery Babylon. Why is it mystery? Because it's a secret, and it's a mystery to them to where they can't understand that they're caught up into sin. And Babylon is utter confusion. They can't think. They can't think rationally. What do you mean I have to love my neighbor as myself? No, man, I'd rather defraud this person and make some more money off of them. I'd rather sell them drugs and make more money off of them. Why would I want to love my neighbor as myself? If I do that, I'm going to lose out. And that's their mindset. They can't see righteousness. They can't comprehend it. So this spirit within man's cardinal mind does not tell him that he's bringing these conditions upon himself. That's why man's history just keeps repeating itself, because he just can't see it. He can't comprehend it. And man keeps practicing the same things from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And mankind just hopes that, well, conditions will change without expecting change within himself. He's not thinking about that he has to change in order for things to change. And that's the consequence of spiritual blindness. So when Satan has his whole world deceived and the minds of the people are blinded, that's what you see. And it's Yahweh, of course, who draws attentions, and a person's attention and opens their mind and gives them that understanding, and that is a great blessing that we should never overlook. But it's Yahweh who draws certain ones of mankind, and Yahweh therefore calls people out of this spiritual blindness. As it says in Yahweh 6, verse 44, no man can come to me unless the Father who has sent me draws him, and I will establish him as a priest at the last day. Notice that. Yahweh says that he's the one. Remember, those who are sent and have certain jobs to do, Yahweh sends them. Yahweh is the ultimate authority. He is the power. And Yahweh draws a person out. You know, we're born with the cardinal mind, and we have to deal with that even here in the house of Yahweh. You know, we're being reborn, and our bodies and our minds are changing through the efforts that we put forth to keep his laws. But we have that cardinal mind that we have to fight against, right? We have that cardinal mind. And that's why, unless we stop and think about what we're doing, we'll make the wrong decisions. You know, but we have to be consciously on guard of these things and thinking about these things. But Yahweh is the one who draws us. Okay, we could be lost, we could be out in the world just like anybody else. But Yahweh drew us into his house. And how did he do that? You know, all of these things are shown to us in the scriptures, just like Yeshua. How could Yeshua be a perfect being? Well, it's possible because Yahweh has control over the genetic structure of people. And he passed those righteous genes. And from one generation, maybe he had 3 righteous genes. Maybe he had 4 unrighteous genes in his body. But those 3 righteous genes still passed on to another generation. And maybe that generation was a righteous generation. And so they passed on more and more and more. When the whole thing was put together and came to Yeshua, even though Miriam and Yosef were not perfect beings, they were sinners, they were mankind, right? But still, in their genes, they had the righteous genes within them. And that's what was passed on to Yeshua. So Yeshua was able to be that perfect person because he had all the right combination that Yahweh had put together in his breeding program. And he put it all within him so that he could live a sinless life. And he could make the righteous decisions. And so remember, it says he set that example for us that we are obligated to walk exactly as Yeshua walked. So we walk that way. It doesn't mean we're not gonna fall, but we'll pick ourselves back up, ask Yahweh for forgiveness, and we keep going, right? And that's what Yahweh gives into us in that great desire. So he calls us, and he says, he draws us, and I will establish him as a priest in the last days, because that's the promise he's given to us, to be in his priesthood, to be a part of the priestly family of Yahweh. And so Pastor says this very certain fact that if you're reading the prophetic word and then you understand the words written within his pages, that's the very sign that Yahweh is also drawing you out. You then come to an understanding, to understand the way of Yahweh, and then you can realize that churchianity is preaching a false way. It's the wide gate, as the scripture says. Yahweh's way is the narrow way. But there is a very great responsibility laid upon you, because if Yahweh's drawing you out, and thus you are one of the called out ones in these last days, then you are placed within the ranks of those called Philadelphia. And remember, Philadelphia means those who are associated with the brothers from the womb, or the 2 witnesses, okay? Now he goes on here and he talks about the first resurrection. He says, Adam, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be in the kingdom of Yahweh because they live by every word of Yahweh and not just the 10 commandments. In Genesis 26, verse 5, it says, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Okay? Remember, he kept the charge, just like we see in that word that we covered earlier. Now, Abraham obeyed my voice. Now, the voice of Yahweh. Okay? Now, let's cover that right now so you should be reviewed, but you should understand it. Yachanaan 5, verse 37. Yeshua said, and the Father himself who has sent me testifies on my behalf. You have neither heard his voice at any time. This is Yeshua saying this. So throughout the history of mankind, no one's ever heard Yahweh's voice, nor have they seen his shape. Remember? Even even Moshe said that. So in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, Yahweh, now remember, no one's ever heard his voice. No one's ever heard Yahweh's voice itself. But in Hebrews it says, Yahweh, who at various times and in different ways spoke. Well, I thought no one ever heard his voice. He spoke in times past to our fathers, notice, through the prophets. That's the reason why Yeshua said to believe all that's spoken by them. Okay? Because Yeshua knew what he was saying. So Yahweh spoke in times past through the prophets. In verse 2, he says, he has in these last days now spoken to us. And notice, days before, they had the prophets. In these last days, he's spoken to us through his son Yeshua. And how he's done that? He's working with Yisrayl Hawkins, the one who is sent. Right? Zechariah 6 talks about them working together. So that's how he speaks. So you can see automatically, the seventh era is so much more blessed than all the other generations that have ever passed before, because of the fact that we have the one whom Yahweh has sent. And that man is inspired directly through Yeshua. And that is an extremely awesome thing to think about, you know. So, we're very, very blessed. Let's look at some examples here of the voices, okay. Here you see, in Genesis 3, verses 9 to 11, you see Abel, okay, when he says, then Yahweh called to Adam. Well, no one's ever heard his voice now. Remember, Yeshua said that. But Yahweh called to Adam and said to him, where are you? In verse 10, he says, so he said, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. I couldn't even find my pajamas, man. I was out there with nothing on, man. So he ran in and hid, right? He was naked. You know, that's the concept. That's the understanding that the Christian world has. Notice what it says in verse 11. He said, who told you were naked? Notice how he says what nakedness means. You have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you that you should not eat. That was his nakedness. It wasn't that Adam was naked with no clothes on, walking around like a hippie in the old days. You know? He didn't have the covering of Yahweh on. Remember, it even says the fig leaves. Remember the fig leaves? Like they say they sewed fig leaves together? That wasn't fig leaves. That was the holy garments that Yahweh had given to mankind. He gave this to Adam and he gave them to Eve. But when they sinned, they broke away from Yahweh, so they were open to open shame because of their sin. That was what he had. Abraham. Remember, Abraham had Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the voice of Yahweh to Abraham. You read, Genesis 26:5, when he says, I've obeyed all of your laws, obeyed your voice, and so forth, all of these things. Moshe had Yethro. And notice what it says here. In Exodus 18, verse 12. Then Yethro, the relative by law to Moshe, took a burnt offering and sacrificed to Yahweh. Now, how could Yethro do that? How could he offer a sacrifice to Yahweh if he wasn't a priest of Yahweh? Is Yahweh going to take one of Satan's preachers and let him offer up a sacrifice? And Yahweh said, oh, yeah, I'll take that thing. No, he was a priest of Yahweh, because only priest of Yahweh can offer sacrifices to Yahweh, right? So Exodus 18, verse 12, he says, Then Yethro, relative by law to Moshe, took a burnt offering and sacrificed to Yahweh. And notice, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Yethro before Yahweh. Okay? So he was the one who taught Moshe. In Deuteronomy, this is very interesting here too, because in Deuteronomy 4, verses 33, 35, and 36. Now this is Moshe speaking to the children of Israel. And he says, Then Yahweh spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. Well, this is a big old flaming. Now, y'all got to remember the Ten Commandments, right? The movie of the Ten Commandments. And you remember how it was that Moshe was standing there and the finger of God came and this big old blast of fire came and burned into this rock, his Ten Commandments. And it burned into the rock and it formed a shape and he gave him these slabs of stone. And poor Moshe is walking with these slabs of stone down this huge mountain, right? And can you imagine going to the top of a mountain? It's hard enough to climb a mountain. Now you got to get down, and then you got to have these tablets of stone that weighs how much? How much? Stone's pretty dang heavy. Pick up one of these big rocks out here. And here he's struggling with this thing coming down before the people. You know? So it's this big, huge fire that he sees, he says, right? So notice what he said. And Yahweh spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words of Yahweh, but you saw no form, and there was only a voice. Verse 13, and he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you. Notice, that's what he heard, the words and the covenant, the commandments, to follow. 10 commandments he wrote on 2 tablets of stone. And Yahweh commanded me at that time. Now notice, Yahweh said he declared to you, the children of Israel. And then now he's saying, and Yahweh commanded me, Moshe, to teach to you statutes and judgments that you are to follow in the land that you are crossing to Jordan to possess. Well, the reason why he taught Moshe, because Moshe was the voice of Yahweh to the children of Israel. Verse 15. take careful heed to yourselves. Notice what he says. For you saw no form when Yahweh spoke to you. Well, how did he speak to him? Yeshua already said no man's ever heard Yahweh's voice. Moshe says Yahweh's talking to you, and I'm talking to you, and I'm telling you what Yahweh told me to tell you, right? So Moshe was his spokesperson. But he says, take careful heed to yourselves, for you saw no form when Yahweh spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of the fire. Now, verse 12 talks about the fire, the words, and so forth that came out of the midst of the fire. But what he was trying to teach him is Moshe was trying to teach the people to believe without seeing. Because remember, he says, you saw no form, you saw no shape. You've got to believe in his word. But of course they couldn't do that. They did not have the zeal within them to believe without seeing. In these last days, we believe without seeing. We have to believe without seeing because that's what Yahweh has commanded of us, and we do it. Verse 33, has any other people heard the voice of their gods? Have you heard the voice of Yahweh speaking out of the fire and lived? Notice, speaking out of the fire. Remember verse 12, he's speaking out of the midst of this fire. And you hear the voice of Yahweh. And boy, Hollywood loves to play that up, don't they? Verse 35, you were shown these things so that you might know that Yahweh is the mighty heavenly Father, and beside him there is no other. Now here's the key in verse 36. From heaven he made you hear his voice. Yahweh came down and said, hey, Mo, you listen to me? Now you got these 10 commandments, you go bring these to these people, okay? He didn't speak audibly to anybody. From heaven means that it came from the heavens. It came from Yahweh down to mankind. Same as the seventh Malach speaks. He speaks from heaven. He descends from heaven. From heaven he made you to hear his voice, that is Moshe, to disciple and instruct you, to discipline and instruct you. On earth he showed you his great fire, like it says in verse 12, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. Now we also know that Yahweh says, my word is like a consuming fire and so forth, right? So this was simply the fire, like the burning bush, was the house of Yahweh. And this is where the people came to hear the voice of Yahweh being presented like he does every Sabbath day. That law's never changed. It's been forever for mankind. Even Yeshua said he didn't make man for the Sabbath. He made the Sabbath for man, right? So when Yahweh made mankind, all 6 days, he went through everything. He made everything so that mankind could be sustained on earth. He made man last, and then he gave him the Sabbath so that he could come before him to hear the voice of Yahweh. So when Adam and Eve rebelled against that and they went away from it, that's when it says they heard the voice of Yahweh in the garden. And you can imagine the Christians hear these rustling of leaves. Because Yahweh's walking through the garden, right? He's coming after, looking, hey, where did he go? I don't know. Here's the Creator, and he's got to look behind the tree to see. Did mankind go behind there? They have no understanding, see? But we do, and we can't take that for granted. It's such a blessing that Yahweh has given it to us, you know? Oh, we got to stop here. We'll stop. The Khan can take over on page 155 next week.